Good evening. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Assistant Director of Public Affairs here at the Kansas City Public Library. And I have the honor of introducing tonight's program because my boss, Henry Fortunato, who I'm sure many of you know, is off on one of his famous walkabouts. He is actually traveling by foot as we speak from Johnson County to Wichita, Kansas. As I mentioned, it is an honor, and it really is an honor. I started reading this book last night, and I made it 3/4 of the way through in one setting before exhaustion finally took hold and I had to sleep. If you're regulars at the library, you know we average about 20 of these events a month, and I have been working here for 6 years. If you do the math on that, it means that I have been involved with somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,500 of these in the last half a decade. I can tell you with absolute certainty that this book is one of my top 15 favorite books that we have had. So, in true Henry form, I thought I would start the evening with a personal story. As I was reading the foreword to the book, it actually brought back some memories of my own father and grandfather and experiences I had that kind of encapsulate the evening. When I was a young boy, my grandfather would tell me about segregation, and essentially what he would tell me was, things are better now than they were then. I wish that I'd realized that then, but in the moment, it wasn't right, it wasn't wrong, it's just the way things were. But I would venture to guess that despite his words, my grandfather still hadn't said more than 3 words to any minority in his lifetime. When I was a little bit older, my father had a good friend from work who was black, who we would go to visit in Kansas City every couple of weeks. I think to this day, those visits were probably important in making me the man that I am today, because if it hadn't been for those visits, I probably wouldn't have encountered a minority until I was in college. And looking back, I think what really strikes me is that to a 6, 7, 8-year-old boy, I didn't see the differences in the way we looked. All I saw was somebody to play with. And it's kind of funny, but I actually remember the one difference that I did notice was the names. And as I recall, the older boy's name was Duke. And I know this for a fact, the boy who was my age was named Crenell, and I promise you in Lawson, Missouri, there were not any Crenells. So fast forward to my life as an adult, and here I am. I'm working at the Kansas City Public Library. One of my best friends is indeed black. One of my bosses is black. I live with my wife and 3-year-old son in a Northland neighborhood that is remarkably diverse, and to quote my grandfather, things are better the way they are now. But one drive through Kansas City makes it clear that things might be better, but we still have a long way to go because things aren't quite right. So with that, it is my honor to introduce Whitney Terrell. He's considered by many to be Kansas City's greatest living author, and he's the man responsible for this event and for the entire Writers at Work series. And he'll introduce this evening's speakers. Please welcome Whitney Terrell.
Hey everybody, I know you want to get the program started, but I got to say my thank yous. First of all, thank you to my son's 2nd grade soccer team who blew out my voice yesterday while I was trying to teach them how to cross the ball. I want to thank the Kansas City Public Library, Crosby, Kemper, Henry Fortunato, Cheptu, Cusatani, Buckner, and Steve, who was just up here for the support for this event and this series. Library's fantastic. You should be a member if you're not a member now. You sign up right out there, okay? I want to thank Rainy Day Books for providing books for this event. They're a great independent bookstore. They're a dying breed, but they've been strong in Kansas City because of the support of people like you. I want to thank the Writers at Work Roundtable, who are the people who pay for this series. Their members are Steve Rivera, Jeanette Nichols, and Patricia Miller. I think Patricia's here. Patricia, you here? Raise your hand. Give her a hand, please. My name is Whitney Terrell. I'm the writer in residence at UMKC. This has been a big UMKC event. We've got help from the UMKC community. I wanted to say thanks to Deputy Chancellor Karen Dace from the UMKC's Division of Diversity, Access, and Equity. Thanks to Jake Wagner from the Urban Studies Program and Linwood Caheed from the Department of Economics, Jacqueline Wood from Black Studies, Shannon Jackson from the Anthropology Department. Also thanks to Diane Smith from the Education Department, who's going to be up here on stage with me talking to Tanner. I'm going to let Tanner and Diane introduce themselves right after I walk up on stage. I just want to say one thing is that I'm from the English department. We have a fantastic program at the English department. I'm proud to be a part of it. Our chair, Jenny Blanton, is here. She can raise her hand and say hi to people. She's enthusiastic about that. I have studied and taught at creative writing programs all across the country and been parts of English departments. I've never been happier or seen a group of more dynamic professors and writers than are assembled at UMKC right now. Maybe that's because they like having me around, and so I'm thankful, but because of that, I am thankful. If you want to study English, or you're interested in studying writing, and you are a graduate or an undergraduate student, we want you to come to us, take our classes, be part of this. It's an exciting time at that program, and I'd love to see you in my classroom. All right. I'm going to let Diane and Tanner introduce themselves now that I've said all the things I have to say. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see such a great crowd here. Let's have a round of applause for Diane and Tanner.
I'll go first. My name's Tanner Colby. I wrote a book that we're going to be talking about. But just a brief capsule of how I got to write that book. I grew up in the South and made my way to New York City, where I was working in advertising and trying to be a writer without really knowing how that worked. And I wound up through a series of cosmic accidents writing 2 biographies, one of John Belushi and one of Chris Farley, both overweight deceased comedians from Saturday Night Live. And having carved out that niche and being the nation's really leading expert in that area, I found I'd completely pigeonholed myself because that's really all people thought I could do. Anytime a celebrity would die, I'd get an email saying, "Oh, you can do this guy?" And so I said, well, I gotta get out of this and do something else. And that was right about the time that Obama secured the nomination in 2008. And me and all my friends were, fist pumping and cheering the TV and here all enthusiastic about America's first black president. And I realized that I didn't actually know any black people at that moment. And I looked around at all these parties my friends and I were having to watch the primaries and the debates, and it's all white people all the time. And I started asking all my white friends, I'm like, how many black people do you actually know, like spend time with? And they're like, 1, 2, maybe. I had a biracial friend in high school, was a common answer. And I was looking for something else to write about, and I said, this might be an interesting take on this subject that we've approached from so many ways and tried to deal with in this country. Since the end of the civil rights movement, we've had 40 years of school busing, affirmative action, fair housing, all these programs. We're still debating them. The Supreme Court actually took it up today, I think, was hearing arguments on affirmative action. So it's been 50 years, 40, 55 years since we thought of all these things and put them into action. And if I don't know any black people 40 years out, then clearly that's a pretty good indication of where we might have gone wrong. So if I go and investigate that, it might yield some answers. And so that's what I did. And that's what led me to Whitney Terrell, because I was talking to a friend of mine from Kansas City. We went to college together. And I was telling him, I need to find a place to write about real estate segregation. And he literally walked right up to his bookshelf. He took Whitney Terrell's King of Kings County book off his shelf. He said, if you want to know about real estate segregation, go to Kansas City. And here we are.
That's very nice. Diane?
My name is Diane Smith, and I am a professor in the School of Education here at UMKC. I have been at UMKC for 22 years, and when I got an email from Whitney about this event, I had seen the book in some magazine, but I didn't pay it any attention because I felt like it was a white guy who wrote the book. And
You don't know how scared all the white guys are who write those books.
and so,
When they know, that's going to be the first thought.
and so I really didn't pay it any attention. Not that I don't read white guys' books, I do. But anyway, I thank you, Whitney, for including me in this event. I was born in 1953 in Jonesville, South Carolina. And so when I first started reading, my husband bought the book for me. And that evening I thought, well, let me get started so that I'll know what I'm talking about on stage. And when I got to about I guess maybe the 20th page, I said, I cannot read this. It was a burden on me. I remember going to bed and having nightmares. after reading 20 pages because I would say, oh yeah, I remember that. And then I would put one of my friends' name in, oh yeah, that was Sylvia. And so it was kind of hard in the beginning. And so I let about 2 weeks go by. And then I thought, well, I got to read the book because I don't want to get up there and not know what I'm talking about. And so I forced myself to read it. And once I really got into it and I got past some of the pain of reliving some of the stuff, I really enjoyed your book. Well researched. I'm a professor. You did some good research on this book.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That has got to make you feel good.
Yeah, it does.
Well, thank you, Diane.
You're welcome.
And thanks for coming. I just thought we could start off. The book's divided into 4 sections. Talk about school segregation, segregation by residential real estate, which is the Kansas City section. Then segregation in advertising,
The workplace.
the workplace, which focuses on advertising, and then segregation in the church. You guys are welcome. We're going to let everyone ask questions at the end of this and talk. But I think for today, we're going to, because we got a limited amount of time, we're going to focus on first Birmingham, which is where you're from, and then talk about how Birmingham is in very surprising and interesting ways connected to Kansas City, which is where we're all from, and we want to talk about. So we're going to give you a little bit of time to talk about Birmingham before we get to talk about Kansas City. But maybe you could just talk about Vestavia High, which is where the book opens.
Yeah, I grew up in Louisiana, actually, until I was in 8th grade, and then I moved to Birmingham, Alabama, because my dad's an architect, and real estate had cratered in Louisiana at the time, but Birmingham was booming, so we moved out there for my dad's new job, and suddenly I found myself living in this place called Vestavia Hills that I had no idea what it was or what we were doing there, and never really thought much about its significance until I went back and looked at it again with fresh eyes, and I said, our official school flag is the Confederate battle flag. That's interesting. And of course, I'd lived there for 4 years and never thought about this because it was just the world we grew up in. Our official school mascot was a Confederate rebel, and our school was founded in 1970 as a direct result to try and evade some of the lawsuits that were going on at the time. Birmingham City schools had been desegregated in 1963, and then everybody started fleeing out to the county schools, which were still segregated, and then it took 7 years for the courts to catch up with the county, and they put a desegregation order on the county, and this township of Vestavia Hills immediately broke off and said, okay, well, we're going to form our own school system where there just happened to be no black people living here. And it was so transparent that the court saddled them with a busing plan to bus black students in from Oxmoor, which is a very, very poor rural part of town about 15 minutes away. And so we had this school busing experiment going on the whole time that I was in school, and it didn't really take that well. And I didn't really, the bus kids didn't have anything to do with us, and we didn't have anything to do with them until I went back and sort of investigated a lot of the reasons why.
I wondered if, Diane, you said when you started the book, right, you had all these painful memories come up. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what your high school experience was like.
Well, I went to segregated schools from first grade until the 10th grade. Brown didn't kick in South Carolina until 1968. And so...
Brown kind of kicked in a little late in most places.
Right.
Yeah,
It seems like.
Brown was late in South Carolina. And so after going to segregated schools for 10 years, I had to go to the high school in Jonesville, where I was born and raised. And that was a tough one for me because I had to leave my friends, I had to leave all of my black teachers to go to the historically white school there in Jonesville. And I remember the 11th grade, and my history teacher was John Morrow. I remember his name till this day. And I was a very smart student. I was in the Honor Society, so I was tracked. And during history, he was talking about the Civil War. And there was this practice in the South where if you didn't use the N word, you would say negra. And whenever he would talk about blacks who were enslaved, he would use the word negra. And so I went home, it just bothered me. And I said to Mama, I said, Mr. Morrow is using the word negra. in class, and it's really Negro. And so I went to the dictionary and I looked up the word Negro because I was going to correct Mr. Morrow. And in the dictionary back then, capital N-E, long line over E, G-R-O, long line over O. So my mama said, girl, don't you go there talking back to that teacher. But I just had to say something to Mr. Morrow about using that ugly term. And so the next day in history class, I raised my hand and he ignored me. I raised it, he ignored me. And so I just put my hand up and left my hand up. And he finally said, Smith, what is it? And I said, Mr. Morrow, you know, you keep saying nigger and it's Negro. I said, I looked in the dictionary and the dictionary has capital N-E and the E has a long O. And I'm doing this in class. And it's G-R-O, and the O has a long line over it, so it's pronounced Negro. Mr. Morrow turned as red as a beet. It got as quiet in the classroom. It was quiet. And he looked at me and he said, Smith, I can say whatever I want to say in this classroom. It's my classroom. And then he said, and if I want to say nigger, I can say nigger.
So your experience was a lot like some of the people that students that Tanner's writing about who were bused into an all-white school, right? I guess you went because your parents were looking for the educational opportunity for you, or is it because it was mandated that you
It was
were?
mandated.
Okay.
When Brown kicked in, we had to go to the school in my community.
Right.
Yeah.
That was one of the more eye-opening things to me is we don't, because of the lens that we view history through in this country, we look at how Brown impacted white schools. We don't really look at it and the impact it had on the black community. And the problem is Brown, for all of its important place in American history, was ultimately rather simple in its approach to the problem, which is that we had two separate Americas. We had two separate societies that both had a lot of cultural capital and values stored up in them, and Brown just said, all right, you know, put these two things together. If segregation is bad, then integration must be good, so start moving everything around. And white people fought it for so long that ultimately the only way to prove that white people weren't cheating was to use black children as the measuring stick. You have 20 black children, therefore you're in compliance with the law. So then it became, all right, these 20 black kids go here, these 20 black kids go here, and just, you know, divvy everyone up in order so that white people can, you know, move on. All right, we've solved this and moved on, but the reality is that black high schools and black communities all across the South were just divvied up and carved up and had, you know, the life cut out of them.
Right. I was going to read a quote, which both of what you guys have been talking about reminded me of. You talk about two students at your high school, Tysley Williams and Chad Jones, right? Tysley Williams was very smart, engaging, honor student, and Chad Jones was an athlete, right, in the group. And one of their teachers, I think, is quoted as saying, I think she was an African-American teacher as well, integration was devastating for that first generation of black children. In black schools, they'd had teachers that cared. Now white teachers had no idea what they were dealing with. I mean, that would speak to your story, Diane, that you were talking about. I wondered if both of you might discuss, you know, the portraits of Tysley Williams and Chad Jones. Diane, if you recognize things in that you thought that you'd encountered yourself.
Well, I had a very good education with my black teachers.
Yeah.
And by the time that I got to Jonesville High, the historically white school, my white teachers were asking me, who taught you how to write like this? Well, who taught you how to speak like this? And I said, my teachers at Foster Chapel Elementary School and Sims High School.
Right.
And they were very amazed that I had the experience of being well taught by black people when I was going to school.
And Tanner, how did you find, was Tysley one of your classmates?
Tysley was one of my classmates. Tysley was my black friend from high school. She was really the only black student who was fully integrated into the student body. One of the problems of how we interpreted Brown v. Board and integration is, you know, we sort of fell back into measuring it as strictly a quantitative thing, like, you know, what percentage of black students do you have at this school? But as King and a lot of other people philosophized from the very beginning, integration is much more about the quality of a relationship. So if you have a school where there are only 3 or 4 black students, but they're running for student government, they're involved in student activities, and they're well integrated socially with the rest of the student body, then that's an integrated school. If you have a school that's 25% black, but there's a line down the middle of the cafeteria and nobody sits with each other, then that's not really a fully integrated school. And what happened in Vestavia was you had all these rich white kids and you had black children who were being bussed in literally from a part of town where there were houses with no running water. It was a very poor rural area that had been isolated and cut off from the rest of the development of the city. And when they bussed those kids into they used to sit around a campfire to stay warm while they would wait for the bus stop to bus them into the rich white suburb where everybody drove their own cars. So it was this huge, huge cultural gap. And the black students, just did not mesh with the rest of the student body. Couldn't, in many cases. But the black students, Tysley was the daughter of one of the teachers, who's also from South Carolina, from the town of Ellery. And there was a huge, divide between the poor black students who were bussed in under mandate and the middle-class black students who were there voluntarily. And the middle-class black students who were there voluntarily did very well. Because they were there because their parents wanted them to be there and supported them in being there. And Tysley was on the debate team with me, and Chad Jones was on several of the athletic teams, and they got along great, but they had to work twice as hard to do it.
And she was sort of had a difficult time, as you describe in the book, because the other black students weren't disapproving of the way that she behaved in school.
Right. They hated her. They called her, said she's acting white and she wants to be white. She thinks she's better than us. And they had, in one of the most bizarre incidents in the entire history of ever, I think, we had this school charity auction at the end of the year, kind of like a bachelor auction. They'd bid on you. The underclassmen would bid on the seniors, and they'd get to haze them for a day and have fun with them. And it was done to raise money for charity, except that the school called it Slave Day.
Not a good idea.
Because that's how we did it back then. And also, it was just, when would a black student ever be popular enough to participate in this activity, right? Well, Tysley was one of the first to really break that barrier. And so the dissonance of having a black student up on the auction block for Slave Day just never really occurred before until Tysley broke that barrier and did it. She was in student government, so she had to be one of the students auctioned off. And the black students pooled all their money and they were going to buy her to really just give her hell and haze her and give her a hard time because she thought that she was better than them because of this cultural divide between them. And weirdly, the white kids had to pool all their money to buy Tysley to save her the hazing from the black kids. So that was sort of the weird social dynamic that we had at the school.
Anything on that?
Yes, I was just thinking, as an educator, I was sitting here thinking about, we're sitting here 2012, and we have some black kids who still taunt each other about acting white. And so we have kids who are very smart. They pretend not to be smart because they don't want to be considered acting white. 2012.
Now, did you get hassled for that?
No, I didn't, because it was a different time, and I was tracked, and there were only 2 blacks in my track. Sylvia and I, and my very best friend Sally was not in my track, but she didn't rib me about being a smart kid.
So you were like, it was like an honors track or something like that?
Yes, I was.
Yeah.
But I do remember when you talk about there was no true integration. When I went to the historically white high school for my last 2 years, we had a separate king and queen. There was the black king and queen and the white king and queen. We had blacks could not participate on the cheerleading squad until my senior year. We just had, everything was separate. And so we were not together. So you're right.
Right.
There was no true integration because there were two of this and two of that.
And in fact, a lot of the tracking programs that we take for granted today of AP, general studies, remedial, those sorts of tracking programs didn't really exist on a widespread formal basis until the late 1960s and early 70s. And they arose partly as a response to forced desegregation. If you force us to put black students in the school, then we'll just sub-segregate the school internally.
Now, I was born in 1967, and one of the things that Tanner talks about in this book, and that the reason I think that books like this are important and it's important to talk about, is you make a point that the history of the civil rights movement itself is well documented, but what happened after, in the period of time that I remember growing up, right, or you, isn't history yet, really. And you had a line about, in certain ways, it wasn't, in the long run, the backlash to the civil rights movement would do its greatest damage not in assault, like in trying to prevent civil rights from happening, but in retreating from, right, engagement with African Americans, right? Is that what you meant by that line?
Yeah, that's certainly true. It's harder to document, an absence of conflict. A lot of what happened after the civil rights movement, there was a lot of maneuvering to make integration as ineffective as possible, and then there was a lot of just settling in oil and water. Like when I was in high school, there's more racist stuff going on at my high school today because it's more integrated and because we have a black president. It's been brought to the surface. Whereas when I was there in the late 1980s, black kids were over there and the white kids were over there, and other than a few incidents with Isley, we just didn't mix. We didn't talk to each other. So it's hard to dramatize that. It's hard to narrate the conflict of that. And the other problem, I think, is that the way we tell history in this country, we like good guys and bad guys, and we like heroes. We like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Jackie Robinson, and we like these stories, of triumph and resolution, and then everything is better. And the history of integration, as opposed to the history of desegregation, there are all these victories. There are plaques for, Brown v. Board happened here, and Birmingham 1963 happened here. But integration was this slow, meandering process where there are really no good guys and bad guys, or very few, and they weren't. It wasn't a time of heroes because we went from a battle of right versus wrong to a battle of who gets what. Because once blacks were allowed into open society, it was like, all right, who's going to get what, who's going to live where, who's going to share what power, and that is a very messy, difficult process. And because it's messy, and because we can't turn it into a neat drama, we tend not to talk about it.
Yeah, which is why it's important. Interesting
Right.
to talk about. Diana, I wondered if you wanted to comment on any of that there. Did you have any comments on what we've been talking about, just about the difficulty of creating history about integration post-civil rights era? Do you teach anything like that?
Post-civil rights?
Yeah.
I teach about the civil rights movement because I think it's important for all of our kids to know.
Yeah, for sure, no doubt.
All of our kids to know about the civil rights movement, because I think that in our public schools, I don't think that it is given enough attention. And
well, Tanner talks about how bad the textbooks were of your high school.
Our high school, the Alabama history textbook used in our high school up until the late 1970s made no mention of Martin Luther King, no mention of Rosa Parks, no mention of the Freedom Rides, no mention of the 16th Street church bombing. The only reference to the entire civil rights movement in the Alabama history textbook was to discuss George Wallace's now celebrated stand in the schoolhouse door to prevent Negro students from entering. And when my history teacher pulled this off the shelf and told me this is what we taught until like 1978, it was like astonishing to me. And 10 years later, when I was in high school, it wasn't much better. It was like 2 pages of, Rosa Parks was noble and Martin Luther King went to the mountaintop and we solved it at the end. Let's not talk about the rest.
Anything about civil rights in high school?
Yeah.
well, when I teach about the Children's March, and you mentioned this in the book, in Alabama, the young people that I teach haven't even heard of the Children's March, that there were children involved in the civil rights movement, and they did not get it in school.
Yeah, I tried to go around and talk to the kids at my high school, at my old high school now, and talking to 17-year-olds is pretty useless about pretty much anything. But talking to white suburban teenagers about race relations is especially pointless, because it's just like, well, you know, I mean, like, diversity is important because, you know, right? So that was about as deep as I could get them to go. So I thought, well, I'll give all these kids a survey, and they can fill it in anonymously, and I can ask them and just sort of general sense of what things are like. And I put a question on there, who was Fred Shuttlesworth? Because Fred Shuttlesworth is, you know, one of the titans of the Birmingham civil rights movement, was really, you know, the guy on the ground who organized a lot of the 63 marches before Martin Luther King came in and really became sort of the galvanizer of it. He was the architect. And I put it on there to trip up the white kids. See, how many white kids are not going to know the answer to this? Well, virtually none of the white kids knew, but most of the black students didn't know either.
Right.
Like 70%, and for God's sake, they named the airport after the man, you know, 6 months before. And still, 70% of the kids didn't know who he was. And, you know, I was an American history major in college at a 4-year private university, Tulane. And I was staggered by what I didn't know, not just about the larger civil rights movement, but what I didn't know about where I came from. You know, and that's why I wrote the book that I did. I didn't go out and write a book about race. I wrote a book about my high school, my neighborhood, my workplace, my church, because I was interested in, okay, how has this impacted me? And what I didn't know about my own life story was astonishing.
Yes, and there are some of my black students have not heard about the Children's March either.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a perfect transition for me, because in the book you talk about the idea of collective amnesia, that nobody at your high school, Vestavia, knew why Vestavia existed. Mm-hmm. They didn't know the history of busing. They didn't know why it was set up the way it was. And a lot of us, although I bet I can probably accept every single person in this room by the fact of their attendance at this meeting, at this reading, don't know why Kansas City is the way it is, right? And so you have a long chapter in the book about Kansas City, how it was residentially segregated, why that segregation has persisted, starting with the connection between Birmingham, where you grew up, and Kansas City. So I thought maybe you could talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah,
And I'm sorry, I'm doing the best I can with the voice.
You know, I came to Kansas City because my friend recommended I talk to Whitney, and Whitney opened my eye to the whole history of J.C. Nichols and the Country Club District and the racial covenants and the whole history of that he dramatized in King of Kings County. And I just got fascinated with J.C. Nichols and his history, and I just started delving deeper and deeper and deeper into, you know, his whole story. And, you know, a lot of the racial covenants that he perfected here in Kansas City, he then took out through the country through the...
Maybe you could define what a racial covenant is.
Racial covenant is the contract or deed of, to a property that says this property may not be sold to persons of color or Jews or, Asians or Orientals as the language was used at the time. So, a covenant in a property deed can stipulate anything, how wide the sidewalk is, how many bedrooms, what's the property setback. And in 1908, J.C. Nichols and a handful of other developers said, blacks are coming out of the South, they're moving into these major northern cities, whites are getting scared, so we can exploit that for purposes of making a dollar. If we create all white real estate, then we can sell it as a premium. And it was a brilliant, brilliant capitalistic American, and brilliant, by brilliant I mean evil, but a uniquely American thing in that in the South, Jim Crow was the law. It was a system of social behaviors and legal apartheid that governed society. In the Midwest and most of the North, you didn't have those same legal strictures in place. So what J.C. Nichols did was he took that idea and he turned it into a product that you could sell called all white neighborhoods and all white land. And so he really sort of privatized racism And it's really kind of an astonishing and a uniquely American thing to do. And as much as the South was, fought tooth and nail to hold on to Jim Crow, it was in the whole rest of the country, in the residential neighborhoods of Chicago and Detroit and everywhere else, where Jim Crow wasn't just a way of life, it was something you owned. It had value, and if you thought you'd lose that value, if you thought that a black neighborhood was going to hit you in your pocketbook, then you held on to it even more vociferously. And so for all the progress that civil rights made in the South, when it got to the bungalow belt neighborhoods of Chicago, Detroit, and Kansas City and other neighborhoods, it just stopped dead in its tracks. And white people are like, okay, we gave you the voting rights, we're done. And that really, King didn't make any forward motion after he tried to tackle the issue of housing. And so
I think it's important to explain exactly how a racial covenant works. I think many people in Kansas City have seen them on the deeds of their homes. I remember seeing my first one when I went and looked through my great aunt's home deed. She lived on Tomahawk Road. And, there's the covenant listed out.
Right.
Now, it wasn't just that J.C. Nichols made every person who bought the house agree not to sell it to someone who was black, but that he created these neighborhood associations that then reinforced those regulations.
What he did in a series of innovations was he, before on the east side of Troost, you had racial covenants attached to the deed for the house, which made it very easy to break. If one neighbor on the block decided to sell to a black family, well then, the whole idea of an all-white block was sort of busted. And so those were really unenforceable. What J.C. Nichols did was he applied the racial covenant not to the deed for the house, but to the filing for the whole subdivision. So the entire area of Crestwood or Mission Hills would have this racial covenant incumbent upon the entire land. And then he would make a neighborhood association, membership in a neighborhood association would be incumbent with the land purchase. So if you bought a home there, you had to become a member of the neighborhood association. And in the legal... Still true. And in the legal, contract of buying into the neighborhood, it wasn't just the homeowner that was responsible for enforcing the racial covenants or the prohibition on selling to blacks. The entire neighborhood association was responsible for every house in the neighborhood. And so therefore, everyone had an incentive to, block everyone else.
There's one other rule that I wanted to make clear. That this was something that I didn't know.
Right.
There's some, if you want, those are all still on the books of home titles. What is the procedure? It's listed in the book. I don't know if you're going to remember. If you want to get it taken off your home title, so that your home title, when you pass it on to some other person, doesn't say cannot be sold to Negroes, Orientals, or Jews, right? If you'd like to take that nice language off your home title.
Yeah, you can't do it because he came up with the other innovation of making them auto-renew every 25 years. And so the only way for them to have them not auto-renew is if the entire neighborhood association, a majority of the neighborhood association voted 5 years prior to the auto-renew date not to have it auto-renew. So you got to have a whole group of neighborhood people forward-thinking enough and progressive and racially conscious enough to say, all right, 5 years from now we don't want, well, no one's going to do that. And he also, in a devious way, made it wasn't a majority of homeowners in the neighborhood, it was the majority holders of front-facing lot footage. So if you could have a small minority of people with huge lots, and they could outvote a majority of people with small lots. So again, if a small core group of rich white people in a neighborhood don't want black neighbors, they don't have to have them, was basically, and so he made these ironclad, these contracts, and it was such a profitable innovation, he started going to real estate developers all over the country and saying, hey, look at this brand new product I've invented, why don't we take it to your city? And he started this consortium of real estate developers that would meet every year in the teens. And I looked and I saw that in its second year, this conference he put together met in Birmingham, Alabama, and was hosted by Robert Jemison, who was basically the J.C. Nichols of Birmingham, Alabama, who built the suburb of Mountain Brook. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I went, my next time back through Birmingham, I went to their public library and I went down to the archives where the Jemison archives are stored, and I started going through all his correspondence. Well, lo and behold, Robert Jemison of Birmingham, Alabama, who built the neighborhoods that I lived in, was best friends with J.C. Nichols. And there's all sorts of correspondence going back and forth between them until I found one letter from 1924 where Robert Jemison wrote to J.C. Nichols and said, hey, I'm starting this new subdivision called Mountain Brook, which is the neighbor of Vestavia Hills where I was, can you send me your racial covenants so that I can use them on my property too? And
It's not an accident
yeah, it was not
that
an
things
accident.
happen this way.
It was not an accident that these types of racial restrictions wound their way all across the country.
But nobody has ever shown that connection.
Right.
In other words, the secret history of these things lies buried until somebody goes and finds it. And
Right.
I mean, I give Tanner a lot of credit for going and finding that and saying, look, the town I grew up in, this man in this other city who developed this process
Right.
of using racial covenants, it did the same thing to my city.
And
It's important.
if you go to Birmingham, if you ever find yourself there, go drive through Mountain Brook, and you'll feel like you're in a hillier version of the Country Club district because it's the exact same thing.
Now we'll have to go see if anyone
Right.
where Diane grew up knew J.C. Nichols.
And if and they even have a plaza, only instead of a Spanish Andalusian architecture, it's English Tudor architecture. But otherwise, it's the exact same thing. And so that's how, Forest Park in Queens, Highland Park in Dallas, St. John's Woods in San Francisco, I think. There's a whole list of neighborhoods in the book. There's all these neighborhoods that look exactly like Mission Hills all over the country because these real estate developers sort of franchised this idea. And then in the 20s and 30s, it became federal housing policy, which we can get to in a bit. So that was one of the odd, strange coincidences of I came to Kansas City through a random connection, and it took me back to Birmingham, where I was from.
Now, Diane, when did you move to Kansas City?
I moved to Kansas City in 1990, August of 1990.
Oh, so you're us now.
Yes, I'm one of us now. But I didn't know anything about Troost.
When you came here.
Yeah, I had no idea about the dividing line.
And how long did it take you to figure that out?
It didn't take me long.
I guess.
Because, and let me tell you, when I first came to look for a place to live, and a university rep didn't take me on the east side. I was taken to look at houses, apartments, all on the west side. And so I had no idea about Troost, and it didn't take me long to
It's
know
kind of hard
what Troost
if
represents.
you're going to teach at UMKC not to
Yes.
see Troost.
And I live 2 blocks from Troost now,
Yeah.
on the west side.
But how much of this history, racial covenant history that Tanner is talking about, and that I was also interested in learning about when I was writing my novel, did people talk about that at all?
No,
Yeah.
no, not at all. But eventually, as I got to know people, white
Yeah.
and black people, I began to learn about the history of Troost and the history of Kansas City as far as the racial divide is concerned. And I live on a street whereby I wouldn't have been able to live on that street regarding these covenants at one time.
Yeah. Now, what did people say the history of Troost was? Because everyone has their own interpretation. Do you remember what kind of stories people would tell?
I have Lois Carruthers in the audience, who is one of my friends. She grew up here in Kansas City, and Lois talked a lot about not being able to go cross certain boundaries on the east side to get over on the west side. And so, of course, I'm not from Kansas City, so I don't know that much geographically about the racial divide as Lois experienced it here as a child. But I do, sometimes I hear black people talk about, oh yeah, I remember that. We couldn't go across that street because of the segregation that existed here in Kansas City.
All right, Tanner. What comes next in the development of Kansas City after J.C. Nichols invents the racial covenant?
Well, after Nichols invents the racial covenant, what comes next is Brown v. Board. After they've subdivided the cityscape this way, Kansas City also had racialized attendance zones for schools, and up until 1954, pretty much every black person in the city was confined to the 18th and Vine district, but blacks were beginning to move out as part of the post-war racial civil rights consciousness was leading to more assertive black population, And what happened was Brown v. Board said you can't have racial attendance zones anymore. And Kansas City, along with a lot of other cities, said, okay, we can't have strictly racially defined attendance zones anymore. Well, then these are neighborhood schools. And they have neighborhood attendance zones. And hey, guess what? It just so happens the neighborhoods are all white. But that then depends on keeping the neighborhoods all white, which means that every time a black person moves on the block this year, then the school district's got to be re-gerrymandered this way. And as you can look at if you look at a population map of the east side of Kansas City, from 1954, it just goes like this. Every year, moves one block down, and the white school districts keeps moving this way, and the black school districts keep going this way, because they keep gerrymandering everything to keep everything in place. The one thing that holds constant is truth, because the blockbusters and the real estate predators that you wrote about in your book, who were moving blacks out of the ghetto into these working class white neighborhoods, respected the truce boundary, because that's how that became the
In part because a lot of those neighborhoods were Nichols neighborhoods that were protected by neighborhood associations.
Right.
So you couldn't sell a house.
Right.
But the covenants weren't as strong on the east side of Troost.
Right.
Right.
And so all these neighborhoods on the east side are just falling like dominoes. Alvin Brooks was gracious enough to give me an interview for the book, and he was one of the first black residents to move in to an all-white neighborhood there. And pretty soon, within a couple of years, the whole neighborhood had turned black, because you had all these real estate predators going in, scaring off white families, buying the houses up for pennies, and then turning around and selling them to black families at totally inflated prices with balloon mortgages and all these crazy schemes.
What year was that?
This is from 1954 through last week.
Maybe you could talk about Bob Wood.
Yeah, Bob Wood was a guy he was one of many of these predatory real estate guys called blockbusters. And what they would do is they'd go into a neighborhood, they'd target an older, elderly white widow on a fixed income, and they would, buy the house next to her and move in a black family. And they would purposefully move in the most unsavory individuals you could find. They didn't go and find the black police officer or the black doctor or the black lawyer. They would go and find criminals and ne'er-do-wells and move them into this house to scare people. And then they'd start calling the older white people in the neighborhood saying, you better sell. Eventually the house isn't going to be worth, not more than $2, but I'll give you $5 today if you're willing to sell. Well, the real value of the house was, $10,000 or $11,000. But the old white woman was so scared that she'd sell in a panic and move out. And, in any market, selling frenzy, prices plummet. And once the old white widow was scared into selling her house for $5,000, well, then the new market value of the neighborhood is set. That's what a house is worth now. So property values would start to plummet, and thus giving rise to this myth that black people lower property values, which is not true, actually. The arrival of blacks in the neighborhood, because housing stock for blacks in the 18th and Vine District was so scarce that, black people were willing to pay more for a house just to get out, to get a decent home and move out of these tenements. The arrival of blacks in a neighborhood increased demand, and increased demand send prices up. So black people actually raise property values until there's a tipping point of fear and selling, and then it starts to plummet. And then you had all these black families who would then have come into the neighborhood buying inflated mortgages, and once the neighborhood had gone black and white people didn't want to live there anymore, then all the property values would be sunk and the black families were left with underwater mortgages. And if this sounds like the subprime mortgage crisis, that's the next chapter. And so this happened all down the east side. And once a school district was zoned to go black, then white families would be desperate to sell. And so that was sort of, blockbusting was technically illegal, and there were these minor reprimands, but there was no real law to say that they had to stop, so they just kept doing it. And we sort of tend to look at the history of real estate discrimination as discriminating against black people, because that was sort of 90% of what the net effect was. But the reality, if you look at it through a slightly different lens, is that by having all this absence of consumer protections for black homeowners meant really that you had an absence of consumer protections for anyone who lived anywhere near black people. So white people basically zeroed out their own property right protections by having all these racist laws against blacks, because once a black family moved into the neighborhood, your mortgage could be declined, or your homeowner's insurance could be raised, even if you're a white, middle-class white family with good credit. So, you know, to me, the more accurate definition of our nation's real estate laws is not that they discriminated against black people per se, but that they discriminated against the very concept of real estate integration. It basically all but made it illegal for black people and white people to be neighbors, even when they wanted to be.
Diane, what was your hometown like in terms of residential segregation or integration?
Well, interestingly enough, where I'm from, and I would imagine it was like this throughout the South, is that black and white folks lived among each other. Of course, there was this segregation, but there was also this living amongst each other or geographically near each other. And Jonesville, South Carolina is a very small, at the time that I was born and was growing up as a child, it was a textile town. And J.P. Morgan, no, not J.P. Morgan, J.P. Stevens Mill. And we had the company store there in town, and working class poor. I'm from a working class poor family in Jonesville, from Jonesville, South Carolina.
So there wasn't, as we have in Kansas City, really bifurcated all one way, all the other neighborhoods.
Well, there were pockets. I remember the Mill Hill. Black folks knew not to go to the Mill Hill because there were some vicious white people on the Mill Hill. And so we knew to stay away from the Mill Hill, because if you went to the Mill Hill, something might happen to you, some violence might happen to you. So we knew not to go to the Mill Hill.
Right. There's an old saying which is somewhat true about race in the North and in the South, which is that in the South, black people get as close as they want as long as they didn't get too high. And in the North, black people can get as high as they want as long as they don't get too close. So in the South, yeah, there are a lot of checkerboarded neighborhoods, and, you know, especially Birmingham and Atlanta, even now, they're not that big. Well, Atlanta's huge now, but, you know, back then, those weren't really that big of cities. And towns like Montgomery and Mobile, they were small towns. So you were in relative proximity, but everybody knew their place. Mm-hmm. But in the North, you know, you have these huge, massive ghettos like Harlem. White people didn't care if black people went up to Harlem and made $1 million. Go, be a black millionaire in Harlem, we're never going to see you. So that was sort of the difference in the two environments. And in terms of real estate, Kansas City is kind of a northern right. city.
So I wondered if you could talk about 4963.
I stumbled upon 4963 reading in the book that you told me about, Kevin Fox Gotham.
But define for them what it is. I think probably both Diane and I live in 4963.
I live in 4963.
Right. 4963 was created as a response to all of this blockbusting that was going on the East Side. You know, a lot of those neighborhoods over on the East Side, they said, you know, we're fine with, you know, some blacks moving in. You know, if you know, but we want to keep our neighborhood. We want to stay. We don't want to move. We don't want to go out to Johnson County. You know, I'm okay if I have 1 or 2 black neighbors. It's fine. It was when it was this overturning of neighborhoods and disruption of whole schools that was really scaring people off. But the whites who lived in those neighborhoods didn't really have the sophistication or the education to really understand how all of these real estate laws were working. When that trend of blockbusting came south, and by the time it hit 47th Street and Blue Hills in the early 1970s, it was running into Rockhurst and UMKC, where you had a lot of property owners and homeowners who were university professors, and they were a little more savvy and sophisticated and proactive about this sort of thing. And they said, well, you know, we want to keep our neighborhood as it is. We want to have an integrated neighborhood where everyone's rights as homeowners are protected, and we can all live together. You know, and there was a group of, you know, hippie liberal do-gooders who had sort of bought into Dr. King's dream of, you know, everybody living together in harmony. And so they formed this 4963 coalition in order to stop all of these destructive and pernicious real estate practices.
All right. I wish I could speak more fluently to you tonight because it's an important issue to me. But it means a lot to me that all you people are here. We create our history together as Kansas Cityans, and this is part of the process. So thank you for being here. I hope you'll buy Tanner's book. I hope you'll go outside and talk to him while he's signing them. I hope you'll come up and say hello to me and Diane. And thanks for coming. I'll see you.
Okay.